Hello, everyone. Welcome to all of you who've joined us today in person and online. My name is Kian Tajbakhsh, and I am the Senior Advisor for the Committee on Forced Migration at Columbia Global, led by Dr. Wafa El-Sadr. As the world has become painfully aware, vulnerable populations in many regions of the world confront the challenges of armed conflicts, as we see painfully today in the Middle East, as well as climate change, poverty, persecution, people smuggling, and the inadequate enforcement of international law. In response to the pressing challenges posed by forced migration worldwide, Columbia felt the moral and intellectual imperative to harness our knowledge for action. The Committee on Forced Migration was established in 2018 as one part of Columbia's contribution to this issue. Our mission at the CFM is to provide a university-wide platform to engage, support, and share knowledge and solutions across Columbia's community of faculty, students, and researchers. We also act as a convener to bring together the world's thought leaders around global migration. The committee sits within Columbia Global, the university's central entity for global engagement. Our proposition is powerful and unparalleled: to harness scholarship, resources, diverse voices, and expertise in confronting the problems of our interconnected world. Columbia Global is exploring new frontiers to redefine the role of the university as an agent in reversing these trends. Columbia Global and its global centers work within countries that host large numbers of refugees and forcibly displaced populations. Displacement and forced migration is a central issue of our work. We also run the Columbia University Scholarship for Displaced Students, which has supported over 50 students from 24 countries studying at 16 of Columbia's schools and affiliates since its launch in 2019. So it is fitting that we have with us today one of the world's leading authorities to discuss the challenges in implementing the UN's Global Compact on Refugees, the subject of the upcoming Global Refugee Forum in December 2023. Our distinguished guest speaker today is Ms. Gillian Triggs. Gillian, who is the UN Assistant Secretary General and Assistant High Commissioner for Protection with UNHCR. Gillian oversees UNHCR's protection work in support of millions of refugees, asylum seekers, and those who have been forcibly displaced within their own country and our states. A dual national of Britain and Australia, Gillian has held a number of leadership roles, including as director of the British Institute of International and Comparative Law in London and the president of the Asian Development Bank Administrative Tribunal. Gillian has supported many not-for-profit groups, including most recently as the chair of Justice Connect, that connects 10,000 lawyers to provide pro bono advice to asylum seekers and others needing legal support. She is also the author of many books and papers on international law. And close to our heart here at Columbia in 2021, Gillian was awarded a Ruth Bader Ginsburg Inaugural Medal of Honor in recognition of her fight for the rule of law and gender equality. Her talk will be followed by a question and answer period moderated by my colleagues, Professor Daniel Nojoks and Ms. Shabnam Fayed. Professor Daniel Nojoks is the director of the International Organization and UN Studies Program at Columbia's SIPA School of International and Public Affairs, where he also directs the UN Partnership Initiative. He has published widely on refugees, migration, development, and global governance. And he was also one of the founding members of Columbia's Committee on Forced Migration. Shabnam was born in Afghanistan and has lived the first 9 years of her life in a refugee community in Quetta, Pakistan. Awarded a scholarship for displaced students here at Columbia, Shabnam received an MA in Human Rights Studies at Columbia University. Currently, she is running the main employment program for refugees for the IRC, helping refugees resettle in New York City. So with that, I would like to turn it over to our distinguished speaker, Gillian.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your welcome, Professor Tajbakhsh, and thank you for allowing me to come to a university, because in my job, For protection, I think it's a long time since I've come into a university. It's a huge pleasure. Thank you for joining me. You're always the most perceptive, constructively critical, I hope, I'm sure, but engaged audience, and it's my absolute pleasure to be with you. So what I'd like to do, if I may, is speak as briefly as I can for 15 minutes to set the scene, and then turn it over to my very distinguished colleagues, and then to get the conversation going, because I really would be very interested in your thoughts of what is the point of the Global Refugee Forum and the compact on which it's based. And now, in order to try to think about that question, I would like to begin by just describing the problem. We're very good in the UN Refugee Agency at describing the problem. We have a lot of data, we know a lot, but what we need to get to now is to find solutions. And that's really what I would really like this discussion to be about, if we can. And I'd like to begin perhaps by picking up on the point that's already been made about the interconnected multiplier effects that lead to the displacement of people forcibly. And I just thought I'd begin with the example about 18 months or so ago in Cameroon, where Lake Chad is drying up, where the tributaries are drying up, and we had that squeeze over years, but within the instant period over a few weeks or months, when there was no grass for cattle, for sheep and goats, and the herders were moving closer to agricultural areas of settled farmers. And those farmers were dependent on the very resources that were also drying up, and that pushed them further to the tributaries, where there were Arab fishermen who'd been fishing for millennia. There was an inter-ethnic and resource-based a rivalry and violence, persecution, hate speech, and ultimately erupted into conflict. And in 1 week, 30,000 people crossed from Lake Chad across into Chad. Now, the interconnected part that the our High Commissioner Philippe Grandi talks about, of course, is that very country, Chad, was also receiving very significant numbers in the tens of thousands, now more than that, of people fleeing the civil conflict in Sudan. And one thing continues to lead to another. And I wanted to start with that example to show you that this is the environment we're in, of conflict, of pressure on resources, on inter-ethnic rivalries that have never been resolved, and the move to countries which are poor and which are also receiving refugees from other countries. So you've got pendular movements, particularly in the Africas. So I'd like to speak very briefly then about what are the trends that we're seeing globally. And one that's very near to my heart and indeed core to the UN Refugee Agency itself is the challenge to the legal norms that underpin the refugee asylum system. Countries now, even in the short time I've been with the UN, which is now about 4.25 years, states that 4 years ago would have agreed with me that the principle of non-refoulement was an important one, and that there was a right to claim territorial asylum as a fundamental principle of international law. Now they will push back. They say the asylum system's broken, doesn't work anymore, it's no longer fit for purpose. The UN system for managing the plight of people forced to flee needs a complete revision, and states have taken the law into their own hands, externalizing to other countries, the UK, Rwanda. You've just seen the recent announcement of Italy and Albania, and there are others in the wind that we, of course, know about at a diplomatic level. We also see pushbacks at sea and at land borders. Now, very clearly now, where states will say the security is the primary objective, and that must ultimately trump the, I must stop using that word. It must push people back, then no longer does the right of the asylum system carry the day. So we've seen a denial of the legal norms that we've all lived with now for nearly 75 years. And of course, it's interesting, the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, we celebrate, I believe, the Article 14. Everyone has a right to seek and enjoy asylum. And that's what is fundamental to the United Nations Refugee Agency, absolutely core to our work. Well, where are we today? A magnitude and a size of the problem that was never envisaged in 1951 when the Refugee Convention was negotiated. Then it was about 2 million displaced people in Europe. Today, we report 114 million people forcibly displaced internally, about 36, 37 million of them refugees. But the number is probably significantly higher. We have conflicts which are larger than they've ever been, and they're more protracted than they've ever been. They're not solved in 3 or 4 years. They are decades long, and the root causes remain unresolved. We see that 66% now of conflicts are more than 5 years long, and they appear to be irresolvable, protracted. We also have a relatively small number of those large conflicts. Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, Sudan, the political instability in the Sahel. We have the situation in Myanmar, now into its 6th year, of people denied statehood, a fundamental breach of human rights that has led to the displacement, among other things, of course, to Bangladesh and other countries. The other trend that I think is worth mentioning is that the traditional solutions that UNHCR has always been known for and has tried to deliver are now proving less and less effective. One, of course, is returns. Most refugees want to return, and that's true even of those families on the border in Jordan with Syria, who've been there for 10 years effectively in desert conditions. You ask them, what can we help you do if you'd like to exercise your right to return to your own country? Can we help you in any ways? Some cash assistance, help you with documentation, help you cross the border. Those families and those women I predominantly speak to say, no, they are safer and they'll stay in Jordan. That creates, of course, its own problem, but returns are difficult, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Syria, Myanmar, and in many other countries that I'm sure we're all very familiar with. So the idea of returning is, of course, critical to the refugee state. And it's also what the host country most wants, but it's extremely difficult to achieve. Resettlement positions are something, they're the gold standard. If we can, for those most vulnerable people, we seek to find resettlement places. The United States, overwhelmingly the most generous of those countries, as that resettlement program has resurrected since COVID. But the numbers who actually receive a resettlement place are minuscule. We estimate about 2 million refugees are so vulnerable they need a resettlement place. And I think this year we put forward about 56,000. The numbers will go up next year. But nonetheless, we're not coming anywhere close to providing real solutions, despite the fact that, of course, we will continue to try to broaden the base to get more resettlement places, and some newer countries are coming in. Regular pathways. We find many politicians in particular talk about this. Well, there are regular pathways. Why do people come irregularly? We don't want to see disorder. People can come in on education, and we see the wonderful scholarships that Columbia is offering as an example. But the numbers globally are tiny. We have now community sponsorship programs, and again, the US leading the way with the welcome call concept, and we see it in some other countries of the world. Labor mobility. Huge potential with labor mobility, partly because many countries in the world are aging and need skills. So let's turn the discussion around to think about labor and a regular entry. And also family reunion is one that is much less political. We can achieve much real numbers. But even so, these regular pathways are very few, given the numbers that we're talking about. So what are we talking about? We're talking about inclusion as, in fact, being the solution, even temporarily, medium to long term, and maybe even much longer term. It's really the solution for most people in terms of protection. But of course, if I were to say that to Pakistan or to Iran, and to Egypt, many countries would say, yes, but the solution you're acknowledging as the most effective solution is one that places the burden on us. We have to pay for access to education for children, for access to healthcare, for possibly competing with our own community for jobs, stress on accommodation. And that, of course, was the underpinning idea that led to the New York Declaration in 2016 to the two compacts, one on migration, the other on refugees, and to the first of the refugee forums. So the idea is a very exciting one. If I could say broadly, 20th century was a period of the negotiation of the international legal human rights environment that you're all very familiar with, including obviously the Refugee Convention is one of the first. But that, of course, is the traditional solution. It's sovereign states with obligations to each other. Now we moved into a different approach, which is using the idea of a compact. The compact is not a legal document. And I would suggest that if you haven't read it, do read it, because it's written in relatively plain English. It's a good read. Get your favorite tipple and go read it tonight if you haven't had a look at it. Because it's very simple and the ideas are very simple. And there are two main ideas. One, that we would have equitable sharing of the burden and responsibilities for refugees. I don't like using the word burden myself because I don't think refugees should be seen as a burden, but nonetheless, the language is in the compact. And indeed, in truth, hosting refugees in the millions that have to be hosted, it is a burden, so we might as well call it one. The other main and inspiring idea is that it's a whole of society approach. It's not only governments and states, but it's the whole of society. So how do we give effect to that solution? And the technique and the mechanism is through the Global Compact on Refugees. So in 2019, we held the first in December, and it was a very exciting event. We had, I think, about 3,000 people there. We got 1,400 pledges, and we were very excited that we saw the beginnings of a sharing at the global level, but we also saw new actors coming in, refugee-led organizations, scholars through what was to become the GAME, the Global Alliance of Universities and Scholars, faith-based groups who are in local communities, who deliver the protection services. They don't go away when the project money runs out, they stay, as do local mayors, local governments, parliamentarians, all were starting to come together. But we hadn't seen any results. We were excited, but we didn't know what was going to happen. Within weeks of that forum, we had COVID emerging in January, February, and you know the rest of the story in the last 4 years. We've had huge headwinds, and those headwinds have had a real impact on our ability to deliver. The mechanism for achieving then the outcomes for this next forum is the idea of pledging as groups of countries and stakeholders. So that whereas a country like Rwanda might have pledged to do some good things on refugee status, documentation, inclusion, access to employment, able to get bank accounts, get the children into school, it made that pledge on the basis that another country or another stakeholder would help it do so, but it didn't eventuate. So by putting the pledges together and matching them, we've got a much better mechanism for achieving compliance. And that means we've got these big multi-stakeholder pledges on inclusion, on education, on gender-based violence, gender equality, on climate, and the impacts of multiplier, impacts of climate. And we've got one on the international development peace nexus. And I believe we will have the indicator report that will be launched next Friday of this week. And that will show some sustained improvement on meeting the objectives of the compact. But it will show that we haven't got anywhere close to equitable sharing of burdens and responsibilities. But some pledges are being implemented. And one element that I think is worth mentioning is that we know that when we started this in 2019, something like 10 or 11% of people had genuine access to work within the countries in which they'd found protection. Now it's 45%. I think that's a big achievement, because the ability to be self-reliant and to contribute to your community is one of the best ways of achieving integration, inclusion, and at least a short-term solution, if not longer. But there are other areas we've not been as successful, and you'll see that in the indicator report. But what I'll do, if I may, is stop there, other than to say that there are two other things that we're working on at UNHCR, and I am very proud that we've been trying to find new solutions with some original thinking. And one is to work with the development banks, as I may have mentioned, but that they have come in now to work with us as humanitarian actors to provide funding, release funding as grants, not concessional loans, largely to poorer African countries. That's released about 11 billion in the last 3 years. That's a lot of money. That's double our spending money for the year. So even though it's not transactional, it doesn't come anywhere near us, it does get to the governments that need support. The other one, I'll leave you with this, is to think much more holistically. That is, rather than worrying all about what's happening in Tunisia and the movements up through Africa to Tunisia and then from Tunisia to Lampedusa and to Europe, and to think in that way, we want to think much more broadly across the whole journey. Where have they come from? Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, and of course we know the others, but there are well-trodden routes all over the world that we can identify. They change, but there are major ones. Why not start to look across those routes with a whole of society approach, engaging the faith groups, the scholars, the local mayors, the refugee-led organizations and refugee voices, to see with development actors, the private sector, the investors, to see if we can find something that's more linked to root causes, but also to ensure protection of people along the routes. And maybe, as you will have seen in the Safety Mobility initiative here in the Americas, to triage people clearly in need of international protection, and those that might be more accurately described as economic migrants. So we have solutions, we're trying to work to solutions, but with these massively increased numbers, we need refreshed thinking. And that's really where you come in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gillian, for all your insights. And oh, should I put it? Okay. And just for being here with us. This is such an honor. The question I have is focused on the policies of host countries related to refugees. It comes as a result of what is happening to the Afghan refugees in Pakistan. How does the global compact on refugees come into play when a host country decides to deport millions of refugees, forcing them to return to a desperate situation?
Well, thank you very much. I know you're from Afghanistan, and you know that's a question dear to your heart. And I was there just a few months ago, and it's both a beautiful country that is coming to life, but it's doing so at the expense of virtually vanishing women and young girls. And it's very, very sad to see when the potential is there. So I haven't answered your question. The purpose of one of the primary purposes of the two is to ensure burden sharing and to support Pakistan in taking on the millions that it has taken on. And it's really failed to do that. So Pakistan becomes increasingly concerned that it does support, if I may say so, the compact. But the government is saying, when we come to December, from Pakistan's point of view, the purposes of the compact are not being met. It hasn't received the support it wanted, and now it's taking things into its own hands. That is deeply troubling, because it's also in breach of the fundamental principle of the refugee law itself, of the convention, that there should never be a return to persecution or danger. And we would broadly take the view that for most purposes that it is dangerous to return to Afghanistan, particularly for those who had fled. Now, this, of course, the crisis has gone on for 40 years or more, and people are in Pakistan over many decades for many different reasons. But we are troubled that something like 20,000 are returning every day, and that's a massive number. So I think, in trying to answer your question, to what extent can the compact help? The compact is designed to support a country like Pakistan, but it's not achieved that in terms of the support that Pakistan had hoped for. We hope that we can work, as we try to diplomatically, to make some carve-outs for minority groups, for unaccompanied minors, for single mothers and children, etc., people who've lived in Pakistan for many, many decades in some cases, That's really where we work in the diplomatic environment. But the core principles of the compact are really not being achieved in the context of Pakistan at the moment.
Thank you so much.
But the aspiration is there.
Gillian, thank you so much. Let me echo the sentiment that Kian and Shabnam also said, that we are very delighted you're here. Many in the community care deeply about refugee issues on a global scale. We feel very much that that what you're doing is important, but of course there's shortcomings. And actually in the spring, I teach in this very room a class on the UN and globalization, where we go through all the role of the UN. And one thing that is always hard to understand is what can an organization such as UNHCR and a forum such as the Global Refugee Forum do vis-a-vis different kinds of states, right? I mean, one thing that's clear that you can't force any state to do anything, right? I mean, that's like that. We often wish you could. We often could say, well, what you're doing there, this is against the convention, please stop. So maybe, can you tell us a little bit more how the alliance building, what kind of different stakeholders, what kind of different states are there, and what kind of mechanisms do you go about changing things on the ground? How can you work with, again, examples, if there's a big country that just says, I hate refugees, I don't let them in, they come by boat, and I don't listen to their, maybe there's not much you can do. But if there are other countries that are more like willing, they don't know what to do, or like what are the political sways, the alliance building, in the preparation for the Global Forum?
Well, I think one of the successes of the compact has been the building of regional support platforms. One on Afghanistan, another the MERPs for the Americas, another for the Horn of Africa, and recently a new support platform for the Central African Republic. That brings together other governments globally to that support platform, along with a whole of society approach. And those support platforms are proving to be quite effective in advocating for that country, for protection of refugees within that country, and supporting the region. And I think that an emphasis on a regional approach with international support is assisted by that mechanism. I think the matching of pledges, which has been happening over the last 4 years, is starting to be effective, where you can bring, for example, you need a school in Zambia for disabled children, for example. Europeans, when you've got something clear like that, you can match the two and you start to see outcomes. I think that these are early days. We were never in the first 4 years of the compact going to achieve its objectives, but we can start to see what's working and build on what's working. And I think we're starting to see some good outcomes. We're also seeing interest in education, which I think is obviously relevant here in a university, but ensuring that students have opportunities for scholarships. And you can do that jointly and see the universities coming together, offering scholarships. Even though the numbers are not enormous at the moment, they really provide a lifeline for young people and enable them then to provide leadership for their own countries and for their own people. So I think we're seeing improvements. We're seeing engagement with the principles. I think one thing, if I could finish, is to say what I've been impressed by is, even though we have the Pakistan example, and we have others, of course, we still have a commitment to the principle of asylum. And virtually all of our member states support the principles of the compact. They are not coming to us at standing committees and executive committee meetings, etc., where they supervise the work of the UN Refugee Agency. They are nonetheless coming, sometimes disappointed, sometimes pointing to data that demonstrates we're not going in the right direction, or with a particular country perspective. But nonetheless, in this environment, we do see a commitment to the principles of the compact. And recently, I don't think you'll mind my quoting him, but the permanent representative ambassador in Geneva from Lebanon, a country with enormous pressures, where a very significant percentage of the population are Syrian refugees and have been there for a very long time with very little opportunity to return. That ambassador used the wonderful phrase that the compact is like lighting a candle in the dark. It provides a way forward, and we've got a long way to go.
Thank you. I have one short question more, and then we're going to open up for questions from the audience, both here. First, we start with a round in the room, and then also online. We will bundle a few questions, right, to just like make sure you pre-formulate them. One short question, then again, we start our Q&A session. My own research is on how refugees, displacement, and migration issues are being incorporated into development strategies, and all the UN Development Assistance frameworks, and now the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation frameworks. And in a meeting earlier today, when we spoke, you gave a couple of additional examples how UNHCR is working on the ground with development banks, with other actors on what we call the humanitarian development nexus, right? We're going beyond protection to broader empowerment through more development. Maybe can you say a few things about that? What has been, what you've been doing there? What maybe still needs to be done?
Well, I think one of the, I don't know that everybody really has understood this because there's so much emphasis on the status of a refugee, but the UN Refugee Agency is really operational. We have about 20,000 colleagues, but we work through partners, and we work at the local level. We have about 550, and the number varies, but across the world, 550 operations. Most of our colleagues, 19,000 of them, are on the ground trying to either deliver service or work with partners who in turn deliver those services. So we are much more operational than frankly I'd realized before I joined the agency. But that means within the UN system as an agency, we really do speak with some authority on what's happening on the ground, and we can see that. The example that I think perhaps might interest you is the example of Kenya, where, of course, the Kakuma camp has been there for 30, 35 years. It's a massive, massive place where refugees have arrived, their families have been born, and their children's children have been born there, and most will never leave. What is now being done is that with the support, political support, and this is worth remembering, the political support of the Kenyan government, they have now moved from the notion of a camp to a settlement, Sharika, which includes the local host community. But the objective is to bring in investment and development actors to enable people to start to build their own businesses, private enterprise, work if there is to be had as businesses grow, but to bring in the World Bank's sort of operation arm, if you like, the International Finance Corporation, which is coming in to provide financial services that helps people get bank accounts, to how to set up a company. There's legal advice, the very, very basic documentation that you need to function within a society. And that will benefit both the refugee communities themselves and the host communities, and hopefully create a town that will be operating in a much more economically viable manner. Now, it's very early days, but it's interesting that a country like Kenya should be doing that, along with, by the way, adopting policies like granting nationality to people who've traditionally been stateless in that country, the Pemba most recently, but trying to identify those within the communities without documentation. And we're seeing other initiatives to do something similar, for example, in Zambia, where a very impressive chieftain had granted 750 square kilometers of land to a refugee camp that will now be, the idea is to encourage investment into that camp to create livelihoods and to engage the local community so that you can lift. Now, we have yet to see how this is going to evolve, but it's an important initiative. And I think we can start to see then the engagement of humanitarian actors with the development sector and the development actors in the private sector, along with, we hope, more efforts on peace and harmony within the local communities.
Thank you so much. Now we'll open up for questions. Do you want to give them mics? Okay, so Shabnam will moderate the first.
Thank you very much. My name is Adam. I'm a senior student care from Australia. And we're very lucky. We had David Miliband come to class last week. Obviously runs the UNHCR, and he spoke obviously the emergency watch list report that he published every year, trying to look obviously future conflicts and potential humanitarian crises. You obviously touched upon it briefly. My question is what's the role of the UNHCR at trying to have preventative measures to obviously anticipate when crises will emerge? And obviously you slightly touched on what more in terms of sort of systematic supports to governments, involvement with non-profits on the ground, what can you do to obviously try and sort of reduce the impact of such crises which are constantly emerging?
Well, thank you. And I think really by working with the World Bank as we have and regional development banks and releasing grants, and in some cases concessional loans, we are helping the government to invest in the infrastructure, the healthcare system, education, etc., that can help to deal with root causes. But the other, and that I think is part of the preventive work. But in the environmental crisis context, my colleagues at UNHCR are really working using this another big term, predictive analytics. But nonetheless, the point is that with slow onset climate consequences, you know it's going to happen. It's not actually very difficult. The scientists can tell us, the political geographers can tell us what the consequences are. We know a lot more about what's happening in these areas. And so we are working on mitigation where possible, prevention, but also adaptation. And hopefully we will be better able to predict where people will, like the Cameroon-Chad example I gave you, we'll be able to predict this more accurately. Now, whether there's the political will behind it to respond, and that's why I came back to the political point with regard to Kenya, where you've got a government that's willing to listen and to work with other partners to get the investment, then you can start to act in advance of displacement, which is going to arise. But very often, as you know, it's ethnic rivalries, it's access to gold, to lithium, to other resources. I mean, there are so many root causes. One of them, of course, gender inequality. We know they're there. There's no great analytical capacity. We know that these are going to lead ultimately to conflicts and to displacement. So I think what we need to do is to bring that work together and to try to propose practical ways of responding.
Hello, my name is Masume, and I was born and lived for 30 years as a refugee in Iran. And I'm very familiar with refugee problems in Iran, Afghan refugee problems in Iran. My question is that what is UNHCR role? How you can solve this problem? Economic problems because of Iran situation, because they don't have any other choice to leave any other place. They cannot leave Iran and live in another country. So what is the solution for them to so that US sanctions doesn't affect them, because they don't, even they cannot find a job, they don't have right to find a job, or many discrimination regarding education, jobs, and other issues.
Are you thinking of refugees, people who have left Iran, or people who remain in Iran but subject to persecution?
Yeah, people who are in Iran, yes, as a refugee, yeah,
from other countries,
from Afghanistan and other countries.
Yes. Well, I think this is very worrying, of course, that the sanctions, of course, typically, mostly prejudice the local community, but that also prejudices people who are seeking a non-discriminatory access to protection within the country. We know that is happening. I know that the Secretary General speaks very clearly that humanitarian work to protect refugees is an exception to sanctions. But that's proved to be surprisingly difficult to implement in practice. many of those, let's say, companies in the supply chain are very, very cautious about carving out exceptions for humanitarian work. I think that's been a matter of debate for a very, very long time. But again, when you come to sanctions, it's a highly political issue. And unfortunately, the people who suffer are the local citizens as well as those refugees who we want to deliver humanitarian support for protection purposes. But thank you. We need much more clarification as to what the humanitarian carve-out is and how we manage it. Thank you.
Separate, like we pull 2 or 3, then we can go online. Yeah?
Hi, my name is Ijaz. I'm from Bangladesh. So my question is regarding the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. Obviously, the situation is more difficult in the terms like Bangladesh is not a signatory of, so they don't have refugee status. The refugee in Rohingyas do not have refugee. So my question to you is, for a country like Bangladesh, where there is also no political will to integrations, and it's been 6 years now, and with a lot of drug trafficking that's happening because there's no access to work and everything that's happening, very near in the future, it's going to create a lot of civil, because already people in Cox's Bazar have a very strong negative vibe about the people of the Rohingyas. My question to you is, in terms of a country that is not a signatory of like accepting refugees in that way, like not giving them the status, and also a country that's not willing to to integrate this population, and in the future it's going to create a lot of civil tensions between the Rohingyas and the population of Bangladesh. So in this sort, also you have been talking about including World Bank, IMF, who would be part of the compact project that you said. So even in those cases, I feel that Bangladesh is also very selective about including World Bank, IMF in the context that World Bank, IMF also have conditions when they are investing, right? So these are a bit critical states there. So my question to you is, in this sort of situation, how does UNHCR actually make it work? Because at this point, there doesn't seem to be any plans or anything of integration, but in the future, it's going to get worse. So what's your thoughts on that?
Like 1 or 2 more. You take 1 or 2 more, like this one.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Susan Michael Strasser. I'm a professor in the School of Public Health. I do a lot of work in South Sudan, and we're seeing an increase in tensions between the bilateral organization, the governments, and the South Sudanese government, not moving forward with elections and compacts that were made. I'm already seeing in my work with the health system significant challenges, and I'm wondering if that is on your radar and what's being done with bordering countries in the event that something escalates over the next year before elections.
Thank you so much for being here. My name is Olivia Sapasi. I'm a student at SIPA, and I was curious, and you've discussed a lot about how working with development banks has been effective in helping countries meet their compacts and their agreements and funding, matching grants and everything. I'm curious, what would you say has been the most effective way to help refugees integrate in the communities and to the host communities? If there's been microfinance projects or things like that, what would you say has been the most successful way of integration? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. My name is Micia. You talk about the regional support platform, especially the one in Central African Republic. And I understand that it fosters dialogue between countries, between regional frameworks, but it also asks countries who have the capacities themselves, so that South Africa was hosting 1 million refugees, people, and countries such as Sudan, the DRC, and other neighbors who have contracted emergencies to do more efforts. So do you think it's very a viable solution that brings tangible benefits?
or it's not just a replicated mechanism that might work in some countries, but also build resources that are already scarce in the humanitarian sector.
So what might be replicating?
You talk about one solution in Kenya, I think on the Horn of Africa, which is a regional platform, but there's also one that's being implemented in Central African Republic.
Yes.
And in this specific case, a lot of countries around are in protracted emergencies, don't have the capacity themselves and have other priorities. So do you think this is either on the right timing or really a viable solution in this specific case?
So developing more support platforms for other countries?
Yes. And in the case of Central African Republic, for example, do you think it's the good timing?
Ah, yes, very interesting. Thank you.
Some easy questions.
Thank you very much, Riyadh, with regard to Bangladesh. Yes, I mean, as time goes by, the situation deteriorates. Crime, drugs, risk of trafficking, exploitation, executions. We've just seen the situation deteriorate over time. The government has been adamant that returns are imperative. But as you say, it's the 6th year, and a tiny number are going back. We have about 250 of our colleagues in Myanmar working in certain areas where it's possible to assist, but it's a country of civil war, and we don't see any immediate solution. So we have a million Rohingya, at least 850 or 900,000 of them in Cox's Bazar, others in other parts of the region. What are the solutions for them? Well, we would, of course, ask for greater level of integration. The government has been determined that it will not allow that integration, and I've seen it myself. Even the smallest little bit of integration over a plot of vegetables to sell in the market was a big issue. Very hard to manage this, but the government feels very firmly that if it allows integration or inclusion in any way at all, then that will be a deterrent or a chilling effect on the willingness to return. But the proof is that it's not worked. They're not returning, and they can't return. And it's simply not realistic for any but a very small number. However, the government initially was totally against any resettlement positions, but now has agreed to resettlement, and the numbers are now quite significantly increasing. Again, particularly driven by the United States, but other countries now providing more settlement places for Rohingya. But it will make it wonderful for the people who get a resettlement place, but make it virtually no difference, because the birth of children massively outweighs the numbers who are ever going to get a resettlement place. So we need a solution. We're stuck. But there have been some tiny movements, discussions. Advocacy is something we try to do a lot of. We are operational, but we, of course, also have to be advocates in the public arena, but carefully, but mainly advocates working slowly with the government. And the government has moved quite a way in the last few months. And it may be that over time, we can find ways in which there can be some adjustment of those policies. But it's a very, very dire situation and getting worse, very troubling. If we could see reasonable numbers returning to North Rakhine State, for example, we would be more optimistic, but frankly, that's not realistic at the moment. But we'll keep working on it. It's all we can do. We are simply one agency within the UN in a situation that's really intractable, very, very difficult to deal with, and heartbreaking for the families that are there in Cox's Bazar, where they're trying to make some kind of a life for themselves. Susan, thank you very much on South Sudan. I mean, one of our great concerns, of course, is that we will see continued escalation. That is the risk. Of course, as you know, very large numbers have gone from Sudan to South Sudan, who were themselves refugees from South Sudan. I mean, this is the sort of pendular movements that we're seeing. But of course, many of those now have moved into Egypt, into Chad, into Eritrea even. I mean, moving through the whole area to find safety. That's the reality. Elections, of course, complicate everything. I didn't really think I would ever find myself saying that, but the frequency of elections in some parts of the African continent actually always create a period of tension and concern, and you're describing that. I think all we can hope is that, well, again, we hope that the conflict in Sudan will come to an end, and that people can find protection and stability where they find themselves. But the needs of the region are huge. And something I haven't talked about, and another challenge, of course, for the UN Refugee Agency, is with the massive numbers increasing, the funding is declining. The other phenomenon is that funding is often what we call earmarked, which goes to particular countries, but it means that we haven't got the funding to put to Mozambique, to Yemen, to Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, etc. We also, I think we've had at least eight coup d'etat in the Sahel region in the last 3 years. I believe 18 coup d'etat in the last few years, 17 of them in the African continent. So huge political instability that you're very well aware of. So are we aware of it? Yes, we are. We're constantly, of course, appealing to stop an escalation of the conflict, but so far you know what's happening. But advocacy behind the scenes, typically diplomacy, are really the routes that we have to, as well as going back to our original role, which is basic humanitarian assistance, plastic sheeting in the DRC, water, hygiene kits, pots and pans, mosquito kits, a little bit of cash distribution, maybe more of that to give people the dignity of choice as to what they spend their money on. But for many, and I know I'm drifting away, but for many, the issue is none of the things that I've been talking about, but it's food. In the DRC, with 6.3 million people displaced, when I speak to groups there, I ask them, how can we help you? What do you most need? What is it the UN can give you? And the UN Refugee Agency obviously can most do. And the answer is always food. They have no food. And that is worsening the whole environment. And you know the reasons for that as well. And it comes back to the point that I think was made earlier. The interconnectivity of all of this is really one of the shocking elements.
One short housekeeping question. Do you have to leave exactly at 12:30, or do you have a few minutes?
No, I'm fine. It's
A
you.
few more minutes.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Then I just want to make sure we don't keep you from rescuing the world, you know?
No, yeah, that's right. Very happy to talk about doing that too. Integration, one of the best examples, we do see very good examples of integration, and one of the best is Uganda. Uganda has 1.5 million refugees. Its borders are opened for asylum claims. Its people have immediate right to register their children in school, to healthcare, and to access to work and to freedom of movement. It's a country that is complying with its international obligations. But as you're aware, it has passed legislation that's deeply troubling with regard to sexual orientation and criminal consequences. So this is the world in which we're dealing with. Many unauthorized de facto governments in coups and counter coups, dealing with countries that have policies that are contrary to fundamental human rights law, but also to the principles of refugee law. But where at the same time, they can be doing a great deal to protect refugees in ways that are really best practice. So where you integrate, and you do so in a way that allows access to employment or to livelihoods, then you're likely to see much better outcomes. Because when the local community can see someone contributing to that community, educating, using their skills to benefit that community, you can find a way of avoiding the worst aspects of tensions. And I don't want to sugarcoat, this is not easy at all. And each country is in a way sui generis. Each is unique to its own environments. And so, generalization is of course difficult to make, especially when we come to the question you asked me, what about Pakistan? What's it going to say about the compact? The last question was the support platforms of Central African Republic. We hope that the idea is replicable, that you can build it in other parts because it's regional and it's local. As you may know, the setting up the Central African Republic support platform was very has taken a long time to achieve. But now there is strong support for it. And my colleagues were there just in the last few weeks for the launch of that platform, because the political will has come together to make it work. But that wasn't there for at least the last 2 to 3 years, even though the idea was there. So we'll see how it works. But if it works for the Central African Republic, then I think we can start to see it would be replicable in other countries where you've got all sorts of political elements to it, along with political rhetoric of one kind or another. So we see it as useful, and we hope that it can be replicated where there are new conflicts.
Okay, we promised our online participants to also open the floor. I put a message in the chat a moment ago. If you would like to get the floor, we don't have a lot of time, but please put your the virtual hand up, which is in the reaction tab of Zoom, and then we can give you the floor. You should put your video on, and can you ask a question, and we should be able to hear you and see you. If there are any people who have questions. That is interesting. So apparently everybody is satisfied and in awe of the wise words we had. In which case we can I see Gizem, Professor, you want to ask a question? Okay, unmute yourself.
Well, actually, most of my questions were answered and were asked. I was going to ask about, so I wanted to really thank you for all this informative panel, and I was going to ask about the UN and regional organizations, but that was also asked and you've answered. I was going to ask about the way leaders, you mentioned Kenyan leader versus chiefs granting land, or maybe granting nationality, offering some representation in different forms. So there seems to be some variation with the way leaders approach how to handle new influxes and these kind of pendulum movements. So the political economy of it is very interesting to me, as there might be more leadership motivations on inclusion and how much to offer representation or even protection, if we think of protection and safety as private good sometimes. But I think, as you said, these are several cases, and we need to see a variation in them and outcomes as certain leaders opt into perhaps offering more and in terms of reintegration or even representation to these groups that really need many different types of services and safety. Yeah, and I also had a question about maybe perceptions, like host, perceptions, whether there is any messaging or other types of work that looks at refugee messaging about who comes and how they're introduced and with the way they're integrated within these societies. Because if we have like more of a multicultural, like a diverse type of messaging, probably tolerance is more, academic work shows that there's more tolerance. So, but most of my questions were answered and asked earlier. So I just wanted to thank again. Yeah.
Thank you then. Is there anything in common? Otherwise we can start the yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I've tried to answer some of the questions. I think perhaps at one point that does need to be made is that political leadership, in a way that works with the local community, explains why the government ensures access to asylum and is attempting to achieve protection through inclusion. I think it's important for political and community leaders to communicate that purpose, and I think that would help much better to achieve a more harmonious approach. But many governments, or some certainly, simply ignore their refugees. They let them into the country, but then they leave them without documentation and without any sort of support at all. And so we see them years later in utter despair, and then the anger starts to build up. And sadly, some politicians will in fact use that environment to create division. But the best of the politicians, of the community leaders, not only political leaders, are the ones that understand the problem, use measured and moderate language, and talk about the value of recognizing the right to claim asylum, because you never know when it's you that needs to claim asylum, particularly in some parts of the world where this is happening all the time. So I think political leadership or community leadership emerges for me as one of the very, very important ingredients. So thank you very much.
So I'm not going to try to summarize everything, but I think we heard really the breadth of what UNHCR is doing, how they're using multilateral platforms such as the Global Refugee Forum to build consensus, not just among states, but using these multi-stakeholder partnerships, bringing in the private sector, bringing in universities, bringing in communities, bringing in all kinds of stakeholders to really change the lives of refugees. Because even though state solutions they have the most power, they often don't exercise the power in the way we hope they would. And so other actors can come in and they can play a very important role. We also heard about how UNHCR is doing more than just refugee status determination and the refugee law, but really going in the development into providing solutions. And it's not just about being recognized as a refugee, but also how you have to enhance your life chances, how to get access to jobs, how to employment, to healthcare, to rights, not just to some kind of status. So I think all these different challenges and how different regional partnerships, global partnerships, and national partnerships can actually enhance that. So I think it was amazing to listen to you, to the things you're doing, the challenges that you're facing, and the UN Refugee Agency. We at Columbia are very, very happy to partner in some of these initiatives. We're always happy to support. So I'm very grateful for you to be here. So Kian, Professor Tashkevash will a short word of thanks, and then we'll leave everybody to, if you haven't had food, there is food. I hope to see you guys soon.
Well, terrific. Thank you very much for an absolutely wonderful panel. It was an honor to host you and to share your leadership and your insights. And I'd also like to thank Shabnam for her important insights and her lived experience. And of course, my dear friend Daniel for his scholarship and his knowledge about this issue. So it leaves me only to say to you that if you want to follow us at the Committee on Forced Migration, if you want to be involved, you could write me an email, me or Daniel, follow up. And only leaves me to join me a warm round of applause for our clients.